Hello.
Hi.
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 Hello.
I'm curious about.
I'm curious about
Building open, authentic, loving relationship.
I'm curious about jealousy.
I'm curious about polyamory.
Does it just mean that you're fucking all the time?
How can I tell my parents that my partner is already married?
I'm curious about.
How do you know when you're too busy to have another relationship?
I'm curious about dominant and subordinate relationships.
I'm curious about sexual health.
How can relationships evolve with people as they grow and change?
Screaming, like my shell is hurting me now, like you actually you don't let it get there.
Well, I do let it get there.
I mean, ideally one doesn't let it get there,
Right.
but yes. Yeah.
No, I appreciate you sharing your humanity with us.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Hi, welcome to the Curious Fox podcast. This podcast is for those who challenge the status quo in love, sex, and relationships. My name is Effy Blue.
And I'm Jacqueline Misla. And on this episode, we're going to be talking with the calming and deeply interesting Adam B. about accessing the pain and grief that is stored in our body and how to connect with our bodies in order to find healing. Adam B. is a sacred intimate as well as a student and teacher of Tantra. His one-on-one work with clients is designed to help people use their erotic energy to more easily navigate through the choices of pleasure and suffering.
Hi, Adam. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Effie. Thank you, Jacqueline. It's really good to be here.
Thanks for being here. You are the first guest that we're having on our podcast that is going to tell us about Tantra, which has been a long discussed topic around the office as one of the things that we want to explore. So when we connected and you were interested in teaching for us, it was very exciting. I was like, great, this is our entryway into exploring this mystical, wonderful part of sexuality that comes from the ancients and teaches us things. So I want to start with two things. One, I want to sort of explain to people, those who don't know what Tantra is, and then I'm interested in how you found your way to it.
Yeah, that's a big question. And I think, as my teachers say, as many bodies as there are in the world, or that is how many different forms of Tantra you will find. And I think that's one of the real beauties of it for me, is that it is such a deeply personal experience of our own bodies and how it expresses itself through that. I think for me, ultimately, Tantra is about that, about going into our bodies, our physical body, our emotional body, our energetic body, and allowing it all to be there, extending that invitation to our full self so that we can really bring consciousness into pleasure, into all the things that make us human, so that we can find our divinity instead of seeking it outside of ourselves, as I think many of us were taught and trained and conditioned to do, that God or whomever we are seeking is out there. But this is really a journey into the body and into that divinity that we can find in ourselves.
Yes, and where does it come from? I know we chatted a little bit, and you said don't ask me too many lineage questions, and I'm not necessarily asking that kind of history. I'm just interested in the roots of it. Like where does it come from? Where does it originate from? Is it here in our here with us today?
Well, what I can tell you is that Swami Rama brought this over to America intentionally. Brought many of these teachings over intentionally. I think in 1969, he became quite famous because he was able to control the physical aspects of his body. He was able to control his heartbeat and raise it and lower it at will. And they had done tests, and through that, he came here to start the Himalayan Institute, which is in Honesdale, Pennsylvania. So getting that started and seeing students. And so one of my teachers, who is really primary in the lineage that I am in now, is Swami Ravi Rudrabharati, who used to be known as Dr. Rudolph Ballantyne. And through him really making it accessible to a Western audience, he's a doctor, he's a medical doctor, was able to write about it and talk about it in a way that our Western minds could understand. And through his book, Kali Rising, he distilled out these 7 principles of Tantra. You're not going to find 7 principles of Tantra in the ancient texts or anything like that. He just made a list because we like lists, and it's easy for us to follow. And so I do bring that in. I bring that into my life and my work. And Swami Ravi is really funny. He talks about, some days there's 6 principles, some days there are 8. But the first one, and really that's really foundational to this practice, is everything is an experiment, is coming into this idea that everything we do is an experiment, everything can be changed. And that if we bring consciousness to all these things that we do, we can gain so much wisdom. The second one, as within, so without, the things that are inside of us are what gets created outside of us. The third being tapas and spanda. They're held in the original Sanskrit because they're not easily translatable into English, but more about this idea of containment, the containment of the masculine, and then that spontaneous energy that comes from the feminine, that creative force, the spanda, that can come through. We can talk about that more when we go into grief. Multiple realities is the fourth, this idea that there's the waking consciousness, this dreamless state, and the dreamless sleep state. And then in addition to those 3, there's the fourth, turiya, where we experience all 3 at the same time. The intermarriage, which we might often think of as samadhi or Christ consciousness. There's many words for it, but this, when our masculine and feminine, or when our linear and circular energies come together and meet in that 6th chakra in the 3rd eye, when we can find that wholeness and see the truth in our bodies and outside of our bodies. The 6th is ascending energy, descending consciousness. That ascending feminine circular energy that comes from the earth, that descending consciousness, that linear masculine energy that we have, and honoring both. Certainly, I would say in this lineage, we consider the feminine, the circular, to be important. She is the power. She is creation, creativity. And the masculine, of course, we need that masculine linear energy, but it's there to provide that containment, to provide the logistics and form. And last is the healing power of pleasure, to trust our pleasure. Pleasure is such a loaded word for a lot of people, depending on how we have been taught to experience that. And certainly we can find those gross pleasures in the body, that powerful energy from sex or ice cream or whatever it might be.
2 of my favorite things you just named.
Right.
Literally.
But the idea is to continue following that and to bring consciousness into it. And yeah, that ice cream can be really pleasurable, but is it really pleasurable if I eat the whole pint? And to pay attention to the body and to continue following that into the more subtle, as we come up the body through the chakras. How can we find those more subtle pleasures, the subtle pleasure of the breath, of the intermarriage, of pure consciousness?
Mm-hmm. I'm definitely finding, as you're describing it, there's like a intertwinement of pleasure with gratitude. The things that we also pay gratitude to are things that are also a source of pleasure. And I guess that's where the gratitude kind of comes from. I think to recognize them as a source of pleasure, and then to pay gratitude for the pleasure, and to recognize and name it as pleasure. That's something that maybe we don't make those leaps, but when I'm hearing you talk about it, it definitely makes me think, oh, like it's in those subtleties that we feel alive and connected, and it is that we give gratitude to, and that connection is pleasure, which is something that I hadn't considered before. So,
And presence, it sounds like being fully present in that moment, in that space. I think Effie and I have similar experiences in that we've spent a lot of time in our heads and have done a lot of work to be in our bodies. And so I'm interested in how you found Tantra and how you came to this moment and this work that you're doing, because I think it is some intentional work that I am doing, that Effie is doing, that many of our community are doing, is to get reconnected to our bodies after feeling disconnected for so many years.
That's a great question. For me, the story I often tell is I came into it because I was following my dick all over the world. And, I love my dick and what it can do. But when I'm only listening to it, I find that it's not very pleasurable in the long term. And so after getting into another relationship that was just disastrous, I was depressed in my bed, and I can't keep doing this. I have to figure something out. I had no idea where to go. I had no idea where to look for answers. And I ended up getting a book. It wasn't even a tantric book. It was a Taoist book, but there were a lot of breathing techniques that we also use in Tantra or in these tantric practices that I do. And the breath, the power of that breath helped me rediscover other parts of my body, primarily my heart. Was able to let me pull that sexual energy from the second chakra up into my heart so that I could actually listen to that and realize that the desires of my dick and the desires of my heart might be different sometimes, and they might need to negotiate a little bit better. And that it might serve me to listen a little bit more fully instead of chasing that sexual desire all over the city. And that was really the start of it for me. And coming into the breath and coming into the power of my heart, of my solar plexus, took me a little bit longer to get up to the throat and the third eye, and realizing the power that was there in my body when I could bring these energies into right relationship, when I could become more aware of the masculine, feminine, the linear and circular energies, how they were showing up, how I could go into dialogue with them. And so all the work I do, all these groups, is all about coming into the body. I think can be really challenging, if not impossible. I mean, we always get something. I believe that everyone gets what they need out of these groups. But it's hard when we're in our heads, and that's a place I know very well. It's a place I found a lot of comfort, particularly in my childhood when I was not able to be in my body. And so my head was where I could go to be safe. And even now, my teachers continue to be a little strict with me about, Adam, stop reading. Just stop reading. Go and do this. Yeah.
Stop reading. Just start being. Is that the prompt? Stop reading. Start being.
Because I do love it. It is pleasurable.
Yeah.
But it's important to come back to the body, to start being, as you said.
For sure, it's definitely a lifelong endeavor for me. We talk about this often. I do it predominantly through dancing. I practice something called 5 rhythms, and I am always looking for other ways as well. And this is definitely something that I've been to weekend retreats. I've kind of dabbled into Tantra, and I feel like that's the next frontier for me. I'm like, I want to learn more about this stuff. And for me, it's also a mental shift because I'm nerdy and, I'm interested in stats and research and, concrete knowledge, and Tantra is knowledge plus feeling, which I'm just like, hold on a second. Like, give me the hard facts. And anytime I talk to anybody about Tantra, they're like, no, you have to feel it. I'm like, what do you mean? Let me understand it first. And they're like, no, you need to feel it. And that's the only way that you get it,
That is exactly my experience. And I think that's why Effy and I partner so well, is that feelings are something that I have tried to avoid for most of my life. And frankly, it wasn't until I realized that it was becoming an impact to my connection, an impact to my work, an impact to my relationships, that I was avoiding these feelings. And over the past 2 years, have done a lot of work around reaccessing my body and my feelings and that pain and that trauma that live there. And it's been a hard 2 years. I've been much more emotional, much more anxious, much more all the things that I was running away from. And Effie and I have been exploring the fact that I feel incredibly grateful that I have now accessed these deeper levels of myself and been able to access my body.
Mm-hmm.
And why I'm now interested in this next step, which is the work that you do around healing.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel it. It's there.
Yeah.
I know where it is in my body. And now, Adam, now what? Talk to me a little bit about when you work with clients and they come to you and they're saying, okay, I'm finally at a place where I want to connect. What does that work look like?
I think the thing that keeps coming through as I'm hearing you talk is surrender, a whole lot of surrender.
Jackie and I are squirming in our chairs right now.
It's the perfect
Literally,
answer.
I had to squirm. I know.
And we are two very controlling, strong-willed women. So surrender is not a word that we hear easily.
Sorry. Yeah. No, I understand. So yeah, for sure. Yeah, carry on, please. Tell us more.
Well, and I get it. I think it's a hard place to be. And I think a lot of us have experienced a lot of trauma in that place of surrender when people have taken from us, when we've allowed ourselves to be present in spaces where we didn't feel safe and we didn't have control. And so the place of surrender I like to talk about is being able to be in a place of surrender that first of all does feel safe for my own body, and questioning, what do I need to do, whether that's feelings or a relationship or a conversation about Black Lives Matter. What do I need to do to feel safe here? And really owning and recognizing that power that comes from being in that place of surrender, from being totally in our bodies and having that trust, whether that's with trusting ourselves, trusting the feelings that are there, trusting another person, whether that's in a conversation or whether we're about to get flogged. There's a lot of power in that gift of surrender. And I do like to think of it as a gift.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Do you mean gift to ourselves, which is what, like, initially when I heard you say that, I was like, oh yeah, it's like a gift to myself, like surrender and let go and all the processing power it takes not to surrender, just like suddenly is free, and that's like a gift, you know? Or do you mean also a surrender, a gift to the persons that you're surrendering to?
Yeah, it's probably easier to think about the gift with another person and putting it into perhaps a BDSM framework, which is a lot cleaner for this discussion. If I'm allowing you to flog me, I'm giving you my body. I'm giving you this gift of surrender for you to take, to do what you wish. Now, usually, if I feel safe enough in that space, whether that's it doesn't have to be flogging, it could be a lot of different things where I'm giving you my body. I'm giving you this gift of my body and surrender. Usually, we both receive quite a bit, even though I'm giving that to you. Usually, there's a lot of pleasure or transformation that can be found there. I think if we were going to bring it back onto ourselves, yeah, we're maybe thinking of it as surrendering, giving that gift of ourselves, understanding that there are multiple bodies, multiple selves, multiple realities present in this space right now. And so offering this body and this waking consciousness to something higher, a higher version of me that can take that and process it, move it, bring a sledgehammer and break it up, which is usually really uncomfortable. Any of those times that we're questioning, confronting the ego that we've spent so much time and effort creating, sustaining, and then surrendering that to something else that might change it, that might move it away. Yeah, it can be really uncomfortable. For me.
Can we explore that some more? Because I think that's what I find fascinating about what you're saying is finding pleasure in the discomfort, finding healing through the pain, that there are these two different concepts that you're melding via this work. And I'm wondering if you can explore, how do we find healing and pleasure as we are exploring grief and pain in our body?
Great question. And I know for me, for my experience, I was taught that pain and pleasure were to be separate, to be separated. Grief and joy are two different things. What I've noticed in myself is that my ability to embrace joy, to be able to love the joy in my body, is also dependent on my ability to love that grief, to be friendly with that grief, to understand that they're both a part of me. And I can push either of them to the side, I can ignore them, or I can choose to be with them. I can choose to be present with them. And I think, like any relationship, when we push someone aside, when we ignore them, we typically don't end up having a friendly relationship. We're not able to receive all of the things that we can in that relationship. And similar to grief or pain or shame or fear, if we're pushing it aside, if we're not looking at it, if we're not in dialogue with it, or I like the word witness, if I'm not there to really witness that grief, how can I love it? How can I truly love myself in that space?
Mm-hmm. When I hear you say that, what's coming up for me is something that I see often with couples that I work with. And I've also actually something that's very alive right now happening for me in a new relationship, which is this idea that you like the parts of a person that you like, and there are the parts that you don't like. And then you kind of either ignore them or like pretend they're not happening, or imagine they're going to change. Like there's a part of them that is, this is compatibility is not a 100% thing, but there's the parts that you revel in and you cherish and excites you and brings you joy, and there's always parts of someone who don't do those things and maybe even do the opposite. And I find that we often either avoid it, pretend it's not there, or expect it's going to change, or we don't address it in a way that we just like let it keep hurting us without really addressing it or allowing it space to change and evolve. So you end up only really partially loving somebody, or you feel partially loved because they're like, I love all these parts and I just don't like these parts. When I hear you say that, it's a similar experience. Like there are parts of us that we love, and it makes it easier to be in our own skin, and parts of us that like we associate with thriving and feeling good, and then there are parts of us that we don't like, and how we deal with those parts, I think, has a direct correlation to the quality of our life and the quality of our sense of self and the quality of our self-esteem. It's not the parts that are easy and joyful. It's the parts that we don't like, how we deal with that. And something I often say is, this idea of love yourself is such a big leap for some people. And I always say to people, like, start with just tolerating yourself. Like, start with actively noticing the parts that you don't like and actively tolerate those parts. Like, we just work with tolerating, and then we can go into like liking, loving, healing, integrating, all the higher level sort of phases, if you will. But just start with like good old fashioned, I'm going to tolerate that part in me, I'm going to tolerate that part in other people.
Yeah, I really love that, and that's very similar to what I often say about being friendly. Being friendly, how can I be friendly with this part of myself? Now, being friendly doesn't mean we have to see each other all the time,
Mm-hmm.
but we can be together,
Right.
and recognize each other's presence.
I think that part of that takes deconstructing the narrative that we have around ourselves. At some point, Effie and I realized that our own narratives around growth and change were quite violent. And Effie came to this awareness. When she talks about change, she's talked about it from the perspective of being a phoenix, of burning everything, burning all of the old down and rising from those ashes. And I've talked about it like being a lobster who has grown too big for its shell and now needs to physically break out of its own skin and shell and wait to grow a new shell again and be vulnerable in that process. And at some point, Effie was gardening and realized that couldn't we grow like plants and just slowly grow and sprout and bloom over time, as opposed to burning things down or shedding one's own skin. And I think that that awareness for me was powerful because it helped me understand that there was a lot of resistance to acknowledging pieces of myself. And when I did, that acknowledgement came in a violent way. So over the course of this global pandemic that we are in, I have found myself to be much more emotional or anxious or less productive. And these are not things that are consistent with the narrative I have about who I am. And so I found myself saying, oh, I never cry this much, or I normally work more than this. And there was a particular narrative that I had. And in that narrative, then I was not loving those pieces of myself that needed to rest and needed to cry and needed to run or needed to move, that I was resistant to that. And so what I hear you saying, and has been a theme for me, is an invitation to acknowledge and see, and then at some point find love for all those pieces of ourselves that may fit outside of the narrative that we have created around who we are.
Yeah. And I think some of those negative narratives we have about ourselves aren't even our own narratives. We've adopted them from an earlier age through other people's comments, feedback, whatever, often in our home, and from flawed humans, because it's to be human is to be flawed, and those narratives got acquired and sort of written into the operating system. And I would, most of the time, when I get to my own negative narratives or clients' negative narratives, quite quickly you can trace them down to like not an inner voice. Like it's a projection or an echo from another time, from another place. And it's just like echoing, like within you. You haven't generated it. You're just like the container that makes it echo over and over again. And I think maybe within this idea of surrender, if you can open up, then it's like you're not a cave anymore, and the echo you can't echo anymore. You can't sustain the echo anymore. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think one of the things you had mentioned about was projection, Effie, and I think coming into that place of surrender to see that projection is within us. And I think for me, one of the biggest leaps has been being able to surrender to myself, to be able to recognize, okay, that is my projection. And what I found is that, when we talk about being friendly or liking or loving these parts of myself, I find that it's usually pretty easy to get to a place of love when I can go in and truly witness these things I may not like. I can love them. I think it's quite hard for us not to love someone when we truly are there and present with them.
Yeah, for sure.
Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like potentially in some of your one-on work or the workshops that you have done? I'm really fascinated. You do work around butt plug meditation and other work that draws us to connection with each other. We are thrilled that on July 15th, you are going to be working with us on tantric exploration of pleasure, pain, and grief. And so I'm interested in what that practically looks like and how self-touch or partner touch is incorporated in this process of healing.
Yeah, I love your questions.
We are curious around here, if you haven't heard. Questions we never run out of.
Yeah, I'm getting chills just thinking about it. So, for the pleasure, pain, and grief event we're gonna do together, that is really an invitation to bring in that grief, to let it be present in the body. And what I usually invite people to do is, to bring it in, whether, grief is often found in the heart, although it doesn't have to be there, certainly. So if I invite that into my body and I drop my consciousness down into that grief, and I'll usually use the prompt of, just pull up a chair to sit beside it. And then to bring in these aspects of this waking consciousness, because certainly if we're sitting in that grief in our heart chakra, that is not in the waking consciousness. That is more in the upper realms. And so we're imagining, we're being there with ourselves, and then to bring in these external senses. What does it look like? What does it taste like? What does it sound like? What does it feel like? And to just witness it. So often we see something we don't like and we turn away. And whether that's outside of our bodies or inside of our bodies, but in this experiment, actually coming in and choosing to decide that I am going to sit here no matter what shows up. I'm going to be here and witness this grief. And then guiding people through a dialogue to perhaps ask that grief, what do you want to tell me? What can I do for you? And sometimes we get really profound answers, and sometimes we don't get anything. And both of those are okay, because like in our interpersonal relationships with each other, sometimes we don't have to say anything. Sometimes it's just enough just to be there, to know that I can show up fully and that you're not going to leave, you're not going to turn away, that you are going to be there.
What you said it was just profound, because that is exactly the tension. It's, if I look away and if I turn away from it, is it going to go away? Like, is the connection still going to be there when I turn back? Is essentially the core of the tension that I see a lot with couples. It's that there is so much anxiety around the connection that even taking, like, glancing away, proverbially speaking, is going to erode it. Like, it just feels so fragile for people. So when you said that just came up for me. It was like, oh, we think connections are way more fragile than they actually are.
And that we are fragile in the fact that if we see that deep pain, if we see that deep shame, that we will not be able to survive it. And what I also hear you, Adam, saying is, if you sit with it and you have been able to survive sitting with it and being uncomfortable, that's the first step towards tolerance, the first step then towards love, the first step towards is just not turning away and fully being seen. And that's what we look for in connection with others, is to be fully seen. And yet many times we're looking to others to fully see us because we are not fully seeing ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's that projection.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was going to talk about the touch aspect of it, which for me is such an important part of this. Because when I'm there with my grief, if we're sitting there together, fully present, and then bring the physical body, bring this external waking consciousness back into it. And what I usually do is just start with like a tap or just a light touch, whether that's in my heart, my shoulder, my leg, my genitals, wherever that might be. And just to provide almost like the nourishing touch of a mother or a grandmother or a lover, just to let it know, like, I am here. And that this comforting touch, this pleasure, can be present too. That it's not just crying and sobbing on the bed. That grief and joy, that pain and pleasure are together. They're part of a spectrum, and that they can be together. And what is it like to be present, to bring our consciousness to both? And then to allow that touch, that pleasure from the touch to expand throughout the body, to wake up the skin, to move even more energy through our chakras, through our body. Usually, I can't really talk about it with much more clarity because it goes into that wordless space of where, as Effy was saying, like, you just, at the beginning, it's one of those things where I think we just have to feel that. And the teachings that come through that are perhaps difficult to talk about, to put words around, to write about in a book, but it does something in our bodies. It shifts the way we understand it, not in our heads, but it certainly shifts the way, for me, what I notice, it shifts the way that I hold that grief or that pain in my body. And I think it makes it easier to become more friendly, to bring that love in, to allow it to show up more. And it brings so much awareness to what actually is grief, what actually is pleasure, which can be really confusing for a lot of us. I think I am certainly experiencing a ton of grief right now. I don't know about you all, but my entire world has completely upended. There's not many things that are the same, and I don't know. And I can choose whether to push that aside and be angry about it, to do all these other things, or I can be with it. And I think bringing that friendliness, bringing that love into the grief gives us so much more space to allow new things to show up, to allow us to shift and transform, perhaps more like that flower or that plant, instead of being the perhaps Jacqueline's lobster that holds on to it, that doesn't look at it, and then suddenly it's like, I can't take it anymore. I've got to break free. And God, this is uncomfortable.
Yeah, I think now that we're talking about this, the main difference is awareness, right? The lobster kind of like becomes aware of its confinement because it feels it. It's like by the time it's aware of it, it's too tight already. And then the only way through it is to break out of it and then take a risk of being shellless for a while and be very vulnerable and then kind of, create a new exoskeleton. Whereas I think the plant way is a continuous awareness of the grief. So you're continually processing and connected to yourself. And that's so that you don't come to these like violent crashes into reality that is of discomfort and confinement and oppression and whatever it is, because you've avoided it for so long and you're now like, it's like smacking you in the face. So you can't really get away from it. And I think what you're describing, Adam, is just being in tune with it all the time. So you're not getting to a point where you're like, screaming, like my shell is hurting me now, like you actually you don't let it get there.
Well, I do let it get there.
I mean, ideally one doesn't let it get there,
Right.
but yes. Yeah.
No, I appreciate you sharing your humanity with us.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Then we're human.
Yes. Very, very human.
Yeah.
It happens all the time. And coming back to one of the principles of Tantra I talked about with this tapas and spanda, and the containment and that spontaneous energy that can come through. The Swami Ravi often talks about the tapas as being the banks of the river. And we can bring those banks so close together that no water can flow through. And when we do that, it's going to find a way to come out. And it's usually going to be coming out sideways. It's going to destroy all the houses along the bank. It's going to flood the neighborhood, destroy the crops. It's not pleasant. But if we can have that awareness of, let's widen those banks this far to allow that grief, to allow the water to flow through, and to know that, I could open them completely, but then it's just going to be this stagnant. The water's not going to be able to flow anywhere. The grief's not going to be able to go anywhere. We're not going to be able to do anything because we need that masculine energy to hold it there, to allow it to come through, and to also notice, when I'm with a client, when I'm at work, I might need to adjust the banks of the river. And when I'm with family, I might need to adjust them again. When I'm in meditation, I can adjust them again. But to have that awareness around that, I think is so critical.
We talked a little bit as we're setting up for the recording. We talked a little bit about sort of the tantric maps or the tantra maps. How does that fit into all this?
I will often refer to it as a map, as in terms of these principles, these philosophies, this map that helps me get where I need to be. I think is so helpful. I think I use the word maps because I like it certainly better than religion or dogma or anything like that.
It's more like principles that help us navigate down the path.
Yeah. And the two maps I use the most are, these tantric principles, and The Wheel of Consent by Betty Martin, which comes in so much into my own personal work and work with clients as well.
I'm interested if we could spend a few minutes exploring that, because you talked about surrender. We've talked a little bit about kink play and how much vulnerability and the gift that it is to give of oneself to a partner or partners in play and in kink and in touch. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about your perspective around consent and making consent sexy and consent as a pathway to pleasure.
Also to healing as well, I think, to healing.
To healing. Wow.
Yeah.
Like many of the words we have brought up today, consent is so loaded and people can come in with all different types of connotations around it. Certainly in my work, I've tried so hard to strip away these ideas that consent is something that's forced upon us, that men have to do because of the Me Too movement now, or that it's unsexy. What I have learned from one of my dear friends, colleagues, when she's also a teacher, has been a wonderful teacher for me, is Korean Diachuk, who always talks about how to bring in that sexiness. Effy, can I use you as an example?
Sure.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it could be really unsexy if I said, well, Effy, I know I have to ask and get your consent for what's about to happen, but is it okay if I touch your shoulder?
Mm-hmm.
And that can be a pretty stilted process of, okay, can I touch your elbow?
Mm-hmm.
But it can be really fucking sexy if we say, Effy, your shoulder and arm is just so beautiful to me right now. I haven't touched a body in what feels like 5 years, but I realize it's probably closer to 4 months. And would it be okay if I just ran my fingers up and down your arm? It would really bring me a lot of pleasure.
I would say, yes, please.
And then to go into, is it okay if I touch it with the back of my hand? Is it okay if I touch it with my face, with my cheek? To negotiate all of these different ways, we might be able to expand that pleasure to make it even better.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm asking for me. I'm asking if I can take from you, and you are surrendering your body to me.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully, in that place, if you're surrendering in your integrity with authenticity, hopefully you're able to receive quite a bit of pleasure in that experiment as well.
For sure. And I think the big difference is when you are asking for consent in sort of the way that you've demonstrated, it is about mutual pleasure. It's about being on the same page and exploring pleasure and going on that journey together. And there's a collaborative tone to it, right? There's a creative tone to it. Whereas I think sometimes where consent stops being a tool for pleasure, it can be when it's used as a protection. So like as long as it can be, I want to ask for consent so I don't get in trouble for doing the thing that I want to do to you. Is a very different way of asking for consent. I think this is what you were getting into earlier. Like it's not very sexy when it feels sterile and with the intention feels like the other person needs a pass. Like they just want to tick things off so they're not going to get in trouble. That it's not about creation. It's not about being creative. It's not about collaboration. It's not about pleasure. It's not about a journey, finding guidance for a journey of body exploration, right? Which is what consent can be. And I think when the intention for it is to cover your own backside essentially so that you make sure that you're getting your ticks in place. I think then it doesn't matter if you're coming from that place. I've been in those situations where the person's asking for consent, but it just feels like I don't want to give it because it feels like they're just trying to cover ground. And even though yes, they're asking for consent, but just the intention isn't aligned.
So glad you brought that up because
yes.
wow, it's so common. And I think for me, what I translate that as being in the shadows of consent, we're not actually in our own integrity. I think when we can show up and be in integrity to truly ask for what we want and to know who it's for. Betty Martin always talks about them as the most important question is to know who is it for? Is it for me or is it for you? And to be really clear about that, which is what I tried to model when I was asking to touch your shoulder and your arm. That was for me because I haven't touched a body. Certainly what I've had a lot of opportunities to experience or when people are in the shadows and they might try to convince me that it's really for me. And that feels really unsafe to say, hey, Effy, I'm a really good massage therapist. Like, you would really enjoy it if I gave you a massage. Do you want to receive a massage? Which we all know that. The thing is, our bodies know that. Our bodies know it immediately. Our heads may not. We may do acrobatics in our heads to rationalize that, oh, it's not a bad person. They're probably okay. And then we consent to it. And then we go into our shadow. We go into that shadow of enduring, of being a victim. And for me, the way that's manifested is then that shadow becomes bigger and bigger to where becomes really difficult for me to be able to say yes to anything. And I think that for me, that's where the biggest healing has taken place when we talk about healing through consent. I was at a point in my life several years ago where I would not surrender. I would not allow anyone to touch me in that way. I couldn't do it. I was holding on to so much trauma around that from people taking without consent that I just said no to everything. And then learning how to negotiate consent for myself allowed me to create a space that felt safe enough to surrender. And then I started to see that really that transformational power of that. We keep talking about surrender. There's a lot more to consent than surrender, and allowing and taking. But to allow myself to say yes and to negotiate for a place that felt safe enough to say yes, and then to slowly see those shadows fade away, and to honor my body and say, oh God, no, that is not where I want to be.
I know I talk about consent often as a part of like being an educator, but to get down to the nuances of it and really understanding it and having this dialogue I think is really interesting and important, because even as somebody who knows about consent, educates about consent, spends a lot of time in places where consent is, there's consent negotiations happen all the time. I feel strong enough within my boundaries and my desires to say yes or no as people ask me for things. One thing though does happen is I've definitely felt fatigued from navigating consent. And I think the difference has been, which is what we're talking about here, where I've been in spaces where consent was negotiated in this very like I just need to get this consent so I can get to the next, do the next thing, right? Which is fine. Like I can negotiate that, but it's tiring to constantly be checking in and almost like trying to understand the motivations behind it to sort of calculate. And I think the default is like no, no, no. I definitely like defaulted to no out of fatigue, not because I'm in touch with my, I would start by like being in touch with my boundaries and my desires, and at some point just the fatigue would kick in and it just go into a straight up no, because I just like couldn't constantly process, do I want this, do I want this with this person, do I want it now, I'm not convinced that they are, the way that they're negotiating consent is making me unsafe. Like I feel like I have to protect myself even though they're asking for consent. Like it just feels unsafe, and that would kind of leave me fatigued, so I just defaulted to no, like no, 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 no. And I think situations where I've found consent was negotiated for creative purposes, for connection purposes, for healing purposes, for collaborative reasons, then the same amount of consent negotiation didn't feel like work. It doesn't fatigue me to a place where I'm like, I just can't deal with this anymore. It actually sort of pushes me down more of an inspirational place and a creative place where I can, that the consent negotiation is about design, and then becomes about designing the experience. It's about following pleasure. It's about tuning into the other person and being tuned into and being seen and being seen. Two very different experiences where on paper, if you scripted it, can look absolutely identical, but have very different experiences when you're living in it.
Totally. Yeah, completely agree. I mean, for me, the most pleasurable, ecstatic experiences have come from that place of negotiating consent, from understanding what you want and giving myself the space to pause and say, well, do I want that? Do I not want that? Maybe I want to be in a different room, or maybe I want to keep my pants on for that. And then to be able to go into I think the first way you're talking about it is, I don't think that safety is there. And if the safety is not there, I think it's really hard to access pleasure.
Yes, for sure. I think that's something that I haven't, and I was gonna, that's something that I haven't cracked. That if I don't feel safe, I don't feel sexy, and maybe like that's a good thing. It's not something that you need to crack. I think that's just like, instead you need to be listening to your body, and it is telling you this isn't safe, so this is not the place to feel sexy.
I want to jump off of that, and if you're comfortable, move the conversation a little bit of a different direction. But in this, as we're talking about safety, as we're talking about what feels like really including all of ourselves, and you've used phrases like the masculine and the feminine in the work, and opening ourselves up to something different. And before the podcast, we had a conversation briefly around the queering of Tantra. And I'm wondering if you can explore that a little bit and talk to us more around how the practices, and particularly in some of the work that you're doing, has looked to include all types of people in the way that they identify and they show up and they love and they live.
Well, I don't know if I can give a very concrete answer to that, but what I can say is in the teachings through this lineage of Tantra, through Swami Rama, Swami Ravi, my teachers, I'm trying to move away from using these gendered words like masculine and feminine, but sometimes it's easiest to understand quickly using other things, as you've heard me say, like that linear energy, that circular energy. But one of the core pieces of this is to understand that we all have that masculine and feminine energy. And even beyond that masculine and feminine energy, the way that Swami Ravi talks about it as sort of a four part, that there's a masculine yin, there's a masculine yang, there's that masculine passive energy, there's that masculine active energy, and then there's also the feminine yin and the feminine yang. He took that from Eugenia Haddon, I believe, and they associate that with different parts of the body. The ones we know, I think, traditionally quite well in this culture are that masculine yang, which is we can think of as the penis, the feminine yin, which we can think of as that nurturing energy, the womb. And then you have the masculine yin, which they associate with the testicles, that holding, that more patient. It's not penetrative. It's not assertive. It's not moving forward with all this force. It's there holding the space and being patient. And then we have that feminine yang, which is associated with birth, with that messy, dirty, painful part of life that also creates the most beautiful thing we can create as humans. And so understanding that we have all four of those and that we're all navigating all of that, that I am not just, I identify as a man, but I am not just that masculine yang. I also need to be able to access these other parts of my body, whether that's the feminine yin, the feminine yang, the masculine yin. Some of those are going to be easier than others. Certainly for me, the masculine yin is what shows up. I think that's where I find the most comfort. That's where we find that tapas and containment. And so I'm always asking myself, am I containing too much? Am I closing those riverbanks so that nothing can get through? Because that spanda, that feminine yang, that birthing creative force is what also needs to come through. And within that, Jacqueline, to try to, I think there is that fluidity and where we identify how we navigate those different energies within us. Because if we're not honoring all four of them, there can be a lot of suffering. And I think coming back to this principle of the healing power of pleasure, to really honor our bodies, to follow the pleasures that are there, to know that if I'm holding on to this identity as a straight man or a gay man or whatever that might be, that it's probably a little more complex than that. There's probably pleasure I can find outside of that identity, and that pleasure in our bodies doesn't have to be just sexual, or it doesn't have to look a certain way, that we can be fluid and flow through all of that and receive so much in that openness.
Yeah, I love the idea of the fluidity of it. I love the idea of tapping into the different pieces of ourselves. I think that that's a theme that I've heard throughout the course of this conversation, is that we often identify as one person, the I, when we are made up of so many different parts of ourselves, and younger parts of ourselves and wiser parts of ourselves, and the more masculine and feminine parts of ourselves, is what I hear you saying. And that it's about creating safe space to explore those parts of ourselves, first with ourselves, and then in consent with someone else. And through that exploration in that safe space, that we can then find the magic between the healing and the pain and the grief and the pleasure, that all of those things can exist together and feel more whole, because we are not looking away at certain pieces. We are not discarding certain pieces, but we are really looking to embrace and explore and welcome and integrate all those pieces.
Yeah, and it's going back to what we were saying about like give me the hard facts, right? It's funny because there are hard facts, meaning a lot of what we talked about in this beautiful way very much shows up in modern psychology and modern therapy practices, right? This idea of multiple selves, be it your conscious, your subconscious, like those kind of multiple selves, as well as this idea of the feminines and the masculines. That's just one modality, but you hear it in things like interfamily systems, which is a type of therapy modality where you kind of recognize the different parts of you that has various reactions to various things because they have an experience they're holding on to from a younger place, right? So it's like this idea of the inner child work, but in a very, very particularly done in like here are all the different parts that are playing their role in the way that you react to things, and it's not coming from this like the I that is present here today with the wisdom of now, but comes from a subconscious, deep, dark place. And I think this idea of integrating it, whether you do it through tantric processes, whether you do it through modern psychological therapy, ideally both, by the way, just as a piece of advice to people, if you're working on stuff, especially if you're working on trauma, top down, bottom up. You need to do as much work with the body as you do with your mind, with your therapist. So I just want to like throw it out there for those who are listening. So it doesn't get better otherwise. And this is from personal experience. And what I'm finding really interesting is it's the same work, right? It's just how you want to receive it is what makes a difference. Like if you want to receive it in the way that we're talking about it, which is this more spiritual, calm, grounded, very body grounded way. If you want to handle it in that way, it's going to work as well as if you want to go really hardcore psychology. It's the same. You're gonna end. It's the human mind and the human body. It's the same. It's the same shell. It's just how you want to get to it. What resonates with you? What really like gets you engaged and keeps and sustains you in the work, right? I think that's where you make decisions on what works for you or not.
Yeah. Thanks for adding that.
So before we wrap up the conversation, I wanted to ask Adam, what are you curious about right now? What is it that is sparking your curiosity, and what have you been thinking about lately?
So many things. There's so many new things around us with COVID-19, with Black Lives Matter, seeing the Spanda come through, all of these protests and all of these voices being raised all over the world. And one of the things I am personally really fascinated with right now are, as we've all come onto screens, we're no longer in this, well, many of us are no longer in our workplaces. It hasn't really changed much for me, but one of the things I noticed really quickly doing groups online when I shifted everything online were all of these intense habits we brought in with our eyes and the way we communicated, the way we formed attachments to screens. Many of us have decades of experience, whether it's with TVs, computers, smartphones. I think we show up in a certain way. I feel like I've noticed a lot of challenges in that. And I've certainly noticed a lot of challenges when it comes to, I think we all have habits related to screens. And then there's even deeper layers of habits when we get to, oh, there's a naked body on a screen. How am I going to show up for that? Or am I just going to come completely out of my body and like take in this beautiful person that is on the screen in front of me and sort of lose myself in that? So it's been a really interesting journey and exploration to connect the eyes, particularly with that third chakra, and how they both play such a role in our identities, how we're able to project out from our eyes, how we're able to receive with our eyes. And that's been a big question for me. What can I actually receive? Or am I always actively looking and grasping at what's in front of me? And what is it like when I actually come into a mode of receptivity with my eyes? For me, that's been really hard. It's been really challenging and been a lot of practice. And that fascination with that continues to grow. So
that really resonates with me. And what you just said about receiving, because I'm definitely the other way. Like when I'm looking, I have a keen eye. I look and I see detail and I see all that is good and all that needs to be fixed. And it's a very active, like I'm doing the doing, I'm doing the looking, and I think what you're saying, which is, can you receive and not actively like almost like penetrate, right? Which is, I have to think about that one. And it's like, what would that look like to kind of just be and allow your vision to just soak in rather than be so ready, so hyper focused to like catch every single detail, which is the way I go about it. And I know that's the way Jackie goes about it too. Especially any kind of environment that I live in, like any domestic environment, I can walk in and I can tell you if anything's out of place, like immediately, you know. And that's because it's a very active, I would even go as far as say aggressive way of just like taking everything in. And what you're suggesting is kind of to invert that and see what comes up if you're not searching for it, if you're not actively like going through like the pixels of your vision. I want to ponder on that. I want to sit with that. I want to see what that feels like, what that can look like.
I feel like there were a lot of invitations for us today.
Yeah.
To look at things differently. I think that there was invitation to rethink surrender, an invitation to really sit in feeling, an invitation to look potentially without doing or without judgment. I feel like I have a list of notes in front of me of all the things, and I'm sure come July 15th that I'm gonna have to bring another notebook. It's gonna be a lot more to learn on that day.
Exactly. Because on July 15, we are inviting you to show up with your pain and grief and with your pleasure. And Adam will be joining us at the Virtual Curiosity Salon to teach tantric expressions of pleasure, pain, and grief. We will experience the fullness of our humanity by sitting with both our pleasure and our pain. In this event, you'll be guided into a tantric exploration of our body to locate the pain and grief that you're holding. You'll be given prompts to help you identify what it is, how it manifests for you. You'll be given time and space to feel into it, let it expand, let it transform if you choose. And you can get tickets for this experience pretty much everywhere. Tickets are available on our Facebook, our Instagram bio, on our website. If you search for We Are Curious Foxes, we come up pretty much everywhere these days.
And if you want to find out more about Adam B and his work and his upcoming events, you can visit adamb.com or on Instagram at AdamBNYC. So it's ADAMBEENYC. And of course, you can go on to social media and follow us at We Are Curious Foxes on Facebook, Instagram, and Patreon. If you're a Patreon member, depending on which tier you are, then you have access to many things. So for all tiers, as little as $5, if you support us, you can get access to all of our previous events, both our virtual events and our in-person events. We have all the videos that are there. We also do monthly socials where we invite our Patreons for free to come and to connect. In August, we're going to have a mixologist join us, and we are all going to be having a happy hour. We'll be sending out the ingredients in advance so that we can all mix our drinks, either virgin or alcoholic, together and join in some sense of community, even if it's over Zoom. And we have monthly opportunities like the monthly Ask Me Anything, where Patreon members can ask Effy Blue questions about their personal experiences and their relationships, and she'll answer. And so if you go onto Patreon and find us at We Are Curious Foxes, you'll find not only the ways that you can continue to support this community, but ways in which we can support you in your journey. And if you're interested in this podcast, if you like what you have heard and want to continue hearing more, then we encourage you to like and review and share the podcast. It really does make a difference. Our goal is to #change the noise. We want to impact. We are aware of all the noise that has created boxes for the ways in which we live and love and have sex. And our goal at Curious Fox is to open up those boxes and those spaces and all the modalities in which we consume information. So that what you read and what you listen to and what you watch and what you attend. And so if you go onto our website, you can read blogs and articles and stories from folks who are thriving and learning in this experience. You can go onto our Patreon and watch videos, and you can listen through this podcast. And if you have questions that you'd like us to explore on the show, you can give us a call and we can play your question and answer it on an upcoming episode. And you can call us at 201-870-0063, or you can reach out to us via social media or via email and share your ideas on upcoming episodes or topics that you'd like to explore at an upcoming event at listening@wearecuriousfoxes.com.
Thank you all so much.
Great. Until next time,
Stay
curious,
curious.
friends. Curious Fox Podcast is not and will never be the final word on any topic. We solely aim to encourage curiosity and provide a space for exploration through connection and story. We encourage you to listen with an open and curious mind, and we'll look forward to your feedback. Stay curious, friends.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.